near the observation windows, not standing with a group, not performing introductions, not angling for eye contact with anyone important. He was just sitting, with a plain cup of something warm held in both hands, looking out at the stars as if he had nowhere else to be and no desire to be anywhere else. He was human. Seraine had met humans before. She found them generally unremarkable, short-lived creatures who compensated for their physical limitations with noise and enthusiasm. But this one was doing something she had never seen any creature do at a diplomatic summit, which was absolutely nothing. He was not watching the room, or if he was doing it in a way that looked identical to not watching the room, and when the Orani delegation swept through the hall with all the noise and presence that a delegation of warrior aristocrats could produce, every other being in the room turned to look, every ambassador, every guard, every aide, every being except the human by the window, who did not turn his head even a fraction. Seraine filed this away the way she filed everything, quietly and precisely. The summit opened the next morning with the standard formalities, speeches from 7 different species about cooperation and shared futures, none of which anyone believed, and Seraine sat through all of it with her hands folded and her attention split between the speakers and the quiet human, whose name she still did not know, and who sat in the 3rd row of the human delegation without any rank insignia that she could identify. His name was not on the seating plaque in front of him. The plaque simply read Hail, M in plain letters with no title and no designation, and in a room where everyone else's plaque included at minimum 3 honorifics, this was either an oversight or a very specific choice. On the second day, something happened that Seraine had not anticipated, a confrontation near the eastern corridor, where a Vorkan enforcer named Dreg had decided that a small Pelian delegate had insulted the Vorkan trading bloc, and had expressed this opinion by grabbing the Pelian by the front of his ceremonial robes and lifting him off the ground. The hall shifted, guards moved to the edges of the room, hands went to weapons, and the particular kind of silence that happens just before something very bad fell over everything. Seraine was already calculating the political damage. An incident on neutral ground would poison the entire summit, and the Pelians were fragile allies that the Orani needed on their eastern border, when she saw the quiet human stand up. He did not move fast, he walked at a pace that was almost casual, crossing the floor with his hands in his pockets, and he stopped about 2 steps from the Vorkan enforcer, who was half again his size and built like a wall. Made of bad decisions. The human said 3 words. Seraine was close enough to hear them, but the language was one she did not recognize, and the words were spoken so quietly that only the enforcer could have heard them clearly, and the enforcer put the Pelian delegate down. Not slowly, not reluctantly. He put him down immediately, took 1 step back, and did not say another word for the rest of the evening. The human straightened the Pelian's robes with 2 quick practice movements, nodded once, and walked back to his seat. Seraine turned to her head aide, Riven, and said, "Find out who that man is." Riven returned an hour later with an expression Seraine had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of someone who had run into a wall they did not know was there. "His file exists, Your Highness," Riven said carefully, "but everything beyond his name and his planet of origin is sealed above our access level. I contacted 3 separate intelligence channels and all 3 came back with the same response." "Which was?" Seraine asked. "They said, and I am quoting exactly, 'Do not pursue this inquiry further.'" Seraine looked across the hall at the human, who had returned to his seat and his cup of something warm and his window full of stars, as if nothing had happened at all, as if the largest enforcer in the room had not just folded like paper at 3 quiet words. She made her decision the way she always made decisions, quickly and without second-guessing herself, because in her experience, second-guessing was just fear wearing a smart hat. She requested a private meeting with the head of the human delegation that afternoon, a round, cheerful man named Ambassador Follis who seemed surprised and genuinely delighted to be asked, and she proposed a diplomatic marriage between the Orani crown and the human delegation. She said it was about trade access and border agreements, and this was partly true. Ambassador Follis blinked several times, excused himself, made a short communication on a private channel, and returned with an answer in under 10 minutes. "He accepts, Your Highness." Seraine asked who exactly had been consulted. Follis smiled with the particular smile of a man who knows something he is not going to say. "Mr. Hale, Your Highness." He was the only one who needed to agree. Seraine nodded as if this were the answer she had expected. She was very good at looking as though things were going according to plan. But that night, alone in her chambers with the twin suns setting outside her window, she sat with the one question she could not file away neatly. What had he said to that enforcer, and why had it worked so completely, and why did a man with no title and no insignia have a file sealed above the Clearance level of an Orani princess? She did not sleep well that night, which, for Surain Varel, was the closest thing to excitement she had felt in years. The Orani homeworld of Verith Prime was beautiful in a way that was specifically designed to make visitors feel small. The capital city of Oran Vass rose in tiers of crystalline towers, each one catching the light differently depending on the hour, and the overall effect was of standing inside something alive and watching and faintly judgmental. Marcus Hale arrived with a single bag. Surain watched him step off the transport and look up at Oran Vass with the same expression he had used to look at the stars from a summit window. Not awe, not intimidation, just a calm and patient interest, the way a man looks at something he intends to understand. The court had assembled on the landing platform in full ceremonial dress, which in Orani tradition meant weapons were visible and faces were not particularly welcoming. 20 of the highest-ranking nobles of the empire, all of them tall and blue-skinned and wearing the kind of expressions that said they had already made a decision about Marcus Hale and the decision was not favorable. Emperor Davin Varel stood at the center. He was older than Surain by 60 years and harder in every way that time and war could make a person hard, and he looked at Marcus the way a man looks at a piece of furniture someone else chose, acknowledging it without approving of it. Marcus walked up to the emperor and did something that made every guard on the platform shift their weight forward. He looked him directly in the eye. Not aggressively, not with challenge or arrogance, but with the simple, level directness of a man who was meeting another man, as opposed to a subject meeting a sovereign, and he said in clear, accented but perfectly grammatical High Orani, "Emperor Varel, your world is extraordinary. I am grateful to be here." The emperor said nothing for a moment. Then he said in common galactic, "You speak our language." "I started learning it 4 months ago," Marcus said. "I wanted to be respectful." The emperor turned and walked inside, which was the Orani way of ending a conversation, and the court followed, and Marcus picked up his single bag and followed them, and Surain walked beside him and said nothing, because she did not yet know what to say. The first weeks were not easy for Marcus, but they were not hard in the way that Surain had expected. She had expected him to struggle with the formality, to make social errors, to bristle at the way the court treated him, which was with the specific kind of politeness that is actually contempt wearing clean clothes. Instead, Marcus learned. He learned the seating hierarchy at formal dinners, which families sat where and why and what insult it was to change the arrangement. He learned the subtle difference between a formal bow and a respectful bow and a bow that implied the other person had done something worth acknowledging. He learned which silences in Orani culture meant agreement and which meant the opposite, and he learned all of it without asking anyone to teach him, apparently by watching. He also began to irritate the court in a specific way that Surain recognized as the irritation of people who have decided something and then kept finding evidence that they were wrong. Her cousin, General Breaker, was the loudest voice against Marcus. Breaker was everything the Orani court admired in a warrior. Which is to say, he was large and decorated and had won many battles and spoke about winning them often, and he had developed a habit of making small cutting remarks in Marcus's direction at formal gatherings. Marcus never responded to these remarks, not with anger, not with wit, not with even the small tightening of expression that would have told Breaker he was landing his shots. He simply looked at Breaker the way you look at weather, acknowledging it without taking it personally. This drove Breaker to escalation. At the 7th formal banquet, a celebration of the Orani victory at the Battle of Three Suns, which was a battle Breaker had been part of and which he had discussed at the previous 6 banquets, Breaker stood up with his ceremonial cup raised and said loudly enough for the whole hall to hear, "Let us also honor our human guest, who has graced us with his presence despite having no battles to his name and no blood on his hands worth mentioning." The hall went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when everyone is watching to see what happens next. Marcus looked up from his meal. He had been eating something Surain's kitchen staff had carefully modified to be compatible with human biology, and he had thanked them personally and by name, which had baffled them entirely, and he looked at Breaker with an expression that was completely pleasant and said, "That is a kind toast. General, I have no quarrel with you." "Then you have no spine either," Breaker said. "I have no quarrel with you," Marcus said again, and went back to his meal. The Orani custom of offering peace was a 3-part refusal. If a challenge was declined 3 times, the challenger was culturally obligated to stand down, and Marcus had clearly done his research, because he went through all 3 refusals with exact phrasing and exact timing, and after the 3rd one, Breaker's face had gone a shade darker and the hall was so quiet that the light fixtures could be heard humming. Then Breaker said, "I challenge you a 4th time, human, in front of this court, and I will not be refused again." The 4th challenge in Orani culture could not be declined. Marcus set down his utensils, folded his napkin with 2 careful movements, and stood up, He was shorter than Breaker by a significant margin and built in a way that read as ordinary next to an Irani warrior, and Surain found herself gripping the edge of the table so hard the knuckles of her hand went pale. The duel lasted 11 seconds. Surain counted. She did not fully see what happened. It was fast in the way that lightning is fast, where you know it occurred but the sequence of it refuses to organize itself in your memory. And then Breaker was on the floor and Marcus was standing above him, and the entire court was frozen. Marcus reached down and offered Breaker his hand. Breaker stared at it for a long moment, then took it, and Marcus helped him to his feet, steadied him with one hand until he had his balance, nodded once, and returned to his seat and his meal as if he had stepped away briefly to use the restroom. The hall did not recover its noise for the rest of the evening. Surain stared at her husband across the long table, at his calm hands and his easy posture and the way he nodded a quiet thank you to the server who refilled his water, and she felt for the first time since she had proposed this marriage that she was possibly the least informed person in the entire room about the man. She had married. After the banquet, as the court dispersed in the stunned, shuffling way of people who have witnessed something they need time to process, Surain's aide Riven appeared at her shoulder and said in a low voice, "I asked one of the human embassy staff about him, just casually, in conversation, and she laughed." She laughed. Surain asked. "Yes," Riven said. "I asked if Mr. Hale had any military experience and she laughed for quite a while, and then she stopped and looked at me very carefully and said, 'How much do you actually want to know?'" Riven paused. "I told her I would need to consult you before answering that question." Surain looked once more at Marcus, who had paused by the exit to hold the door open for two elderly court officials who had not acknowledged his existence since he arrived. He held the door, nodded to them as they passed, and walked out alone into the corridor. "Tell her," Surain said, "that we want to know everything. Surain Varel had access to some of the best intelligence networks in the known galaxy. The Irani Empire maintained archives on every species, every political figure, and every military engagement that had occurred within 20 light years of their borders for the last 300 years, and she used all of it. She started small, thinking she would find the answer quickly. A decorated soldier, perhaps, or a former law enforcement officer, something that would explain the 11 seconds and the enforcer at the summit and the sealed file, something that would make the picture of Marcus Hale settle into a shape she recognized. Instead, the more she looked, the less the picture settled. His public record was clean and short. Born in a mid-sized city on Earth, no unusual academic history, served in the human military for 12 years, honorably discharged, subsequently listed as a civilian consultant in an unspecified capacity. The kind of record that looks like a record but contains nothing, which in Surain's experience meant the real record was somewhere else entirely. She went deeper. She called in a favor from an Irani intelligence director who owed her family a significant debt, a sharp woman named Karev who had access to sealed galactic military archives, and Karev came back to her 3 days later looking as though she had found something in the files that she genuinely wished she had not. The human was part of a unit called Ironwatch, Karev said. She was sitting across from Surain in a private office with the door locked, and she kept her voice low even though there was no one else in the room. They operated during what the humans call the Silence War, a conflict with the Keth Dominion that lasted 12 years and was fought entirely in uncharted space beyond. Galactic Survey Range. "I have never heard of the Silence War," Surain said. "Neither had I," Karev said. "Neither has most of the galaxy. It was fought in the dark, with no observers, no correspondence, and no treaty negotiations until the very end. The humans sent 200 soldiers into Keth territory under full communication blackout. No resupply orders, no extraction plans, no official acknowledgement that the mission existed at all." Surain was very still. "Of the 200 soldiers," Karev continued, 7 came back. Your husband was the last commanding officer of Ironwatch. He held the unit together for 9 years behind enemy lines, and at the end of the war, he entered the Keth High Command facility alone and emerged 3 hours later with the Keth High Commander's formal surrender written in the High Commander's own hand. The room was absolutely quiet. He negotiated the surrender alone. Surain asked. "He did not negotiate it," Karev said carefully. "The records are incomplete, but the Keth's own archives, which we obtained through a third party, describe the event as, and I am using their exact phrasing, a voluntary capitulation to prevent further loss." She paused. "The Keth do not capitulate. In 300 years of recorded galactic history, they have never once surrendered to any species for any reason, and they surrendered to one human." Sitting alone in a room, Surain stood up and walked to the window. "There is more," Karev said. "Tell me." After the war ended, the Keth issued something they call a blood warning. It It is a cultural designation they reserve only for extreme cases. It means in direct translation, do not engage this individual under any circumstances, for any reason, at any time. They distributed his physical description and what limited identifying information they had to every species they conduct trade with. Karev set a thin file on the desk between them. That is why the enforcer at the summit backed down. The Vorkan trade extensively with the Keth. Every Vorkan military enforcer operating anywhere in the galaxy knows that face. Surain turned from the window and looked at the file but did not pick it up. And the human memorial? She asked. She had found a reference to it buried in one of the archive branches and had not yet followed it. Karev's expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. I think you should see that one yourself, Your Highness. The Human Memorial Archive was accessible through a standard diplomatic cultural exchange channel, a public record, technically, though detailed enough that most people never found it, and Surain accessed it alone, late at night, sitting in her private study with all other lights off. The monument registry was organized by category: fallen soldiers, surviving veterans, honored civilians, and then at the very end, a fourth category that the registry translated into Irani as something that meant approximately those who came back when the door was closed. There were 11 names in this category across all of recorded human military history. Marcus Hale was the most recent entry. Surain read the entry 3 times, not because it was long, it was only 4 lines, but because each time she read it, the meaning shifted slightly underneath her, the way ground shifts when you are walking and realize the terrain is different from what you assumed. She closed the archive, turned off her study light, and walked out to the balcony. Marcus was already there. He was sitting in the low chair he had claimed as his within the first week of arriving, doing nothing in particular, looking at the sky, with 3 small local birds sitting on the railing directly beside him, small orange-feathered things that were, as far as Surain knew, genuinely terrified of everyone and had been since the species was first catalogued. They were pressed close to him in the easy, unconcerned way of animals that have decided something is safe and stopped worrying about it. She stood in the doorway and looked at him for a long time. He did not look like a man who had spent 9 years behind enemy lines in the dark. He did not look like a man who had walked alone into a room with the Keth High Commander and walked back out again with a surrender document. He looked like a man who was completely content to sit on a balcony in the dark with some small birds and a sky full of stars and no particular need for anything else. You are awake late, he said, without turning around, because apparently he had been aware she was standing there the entire time. I was reading, she said. Anything good? She looked at him, at the plain, quiet, entirely unremarkable shape of him sitting in that chair, and she said, I am not sure yet. And she went back inside, because she needed to think, and she had discovered that thinking near Marcus Hale had started to feel like trying to think while standing at the edge of a very deep lake. She kept looking at the surface and having the persistent, unsettling feeling that she had no idea at all how far down it went. The next morning she went to find Karev again. One more thing, Surain said. The 3 words he said to the enforcer at the summit, the language they were spoken in, can you identify it? Karev checked her files for a moment and then looked up. It was a Keth military dialect, a very specific register used exclusively by high-ranking Keth officers addressing someone beneath their authority. She paused again. The direct translation of the 3 words is, I remember you. Surain stood very still. He told a Vorkan enforcer, she said slowly, in the Keth's own language and their own register of authority, that he remembered him. Yes, Karev said. And the enforcer believed him. Apparently without any hesitation at all, Karev said. Surain walked back to the palace through the crystal streets of Oran Vass, and she thought about a man with a sealed file and a blood warning and 4 lines in a memorial, sitting on a balcony feeding birds that were afraid of everyone else in the known galaxy, and she thought, there is a very large difference between knowing someone's record and knowing who they are, and she had married this man without knowing either the Keth Splinter Fleet appeared at the edge of Irani space on a morning when everything else was going normally, which was the kind of timing that felt very deliberate. 14 warships in a tight formation that the Irani deep-range sensors flagged immediately as Keth military configuration, moving at a steady, unhurried pace toward the inner systems and broadcasting on every open channel simultaneously. The message was simple and identical on every frequency. Deliver the human called Hale to the border within 72 hours or we begin burning your colonies. The War Council met within the hour. 14 of the highest military and political figures in the Irani Empire gathered around the long table in the command center of the capital, with the Keth fleet blinking on the holographic display above them like a slow red heartbeat, and the conversation was fast and not calm at all. General Breaker, whose arm had fully healed and who had not spoken directly to Marcus since the night of the banquet, was already in favor of a military response before the meeting was officially opened. He had fleet positions ready on a secondary display and was describing an intercepting maneuver to the officer beside him while the Emperor was still being seated. Two of the border governors spoke in favor of compliance, not enthusiastically, but with the flat pragmatism of men whose territories were the ones currently in range. Their colonies were the ones that would burn, and they wanted very much for them not to burn. Emperor Davin sat at the head of the table and said nothing for the first 10 minutes, which in Davin's case meant he was thinking at full speed and had not yet arrived at a direction, and that particular combination in Davin was, in Siraine's experience, slightly more dangerous than him having already decided. Siraine sat across from her father and watched the holographic display pulse and thought about 4 lines in a memorial registry. The human should be handed over, said Lord Varret, the eldest member of the council, in the careful tone of someone presenting arithmetic. He is not Orani. His life does not fall under imperial protection. The calculus is not complicated. He is my husband, Siraine said. He is a diplomatic arrangement, Varret replied. He is my husband, Siraine said again, with a different weight on the words this time, the kind of weight that comes from having spent 3 sleepless nights reading intelligence files and watching a man feed birds in the dark and reassembling everything you thought you understood into a shape that meant something entirely different. And she looked at her father. And before this council makes any decisions, I would like to know if anyone here is actually aware of who they are discussing handing over. The door to the War Council chamber opened. No one had given permission for it to open, and so every head at the table turned, and Marcus Hale walked in with a plain cup of something warm, the way he always did, and he stood at the edge of the room and looked at the holographic display of the Keth fleet with his eyes moving across it in a pattern that Siraine had started to recognize, which was him reading something as opposed to simply looking at it. You should not be in this chamber, Lord Varret said. Marcus did not look at Varret. He was looking at the display. The formation is wrong for an assault, he said. His voice was the same as it always was, which was even and unhurried. The 2nd and 5th ships are positioned outside standard Keth combat range. They only do that when they are expecting to receive a communication and want the command vessel shielded during the exchange. The military officers at the table looked at each other and then at the display. They are not here to fight, Marcus said. They are here because someone on their command staff believes this specific approach will work, which means their commander is not one of the veterans. It is someone younger who has heard the story but does not fully understand what the story means. He set his cup down on the edge of the table and looked at the Emperor directly. If you allow me to make a communication, I can end this without a single one of your ships leaving the dock. The Emperor looked at Marcus for a long moment. It was the same measuring look he had given him on the landing platform the day he arrived, except this time something in it had shifted. Something had moved behind Davin's eyes, something careful and assessing, the look of a man who has been shown a door he did not know was there and is deciding whether to open it. You are certain? Davin asked. No, Marcus said, but I am willing to find out. Davin looked at his council, at Breaker with his fleet positions and Varret with his arithmetic and the 2 border governors with their quiet desperation, and then he looked back at Marcus and said, give him the channel. The council gave Marcus access to the primary open channel transmitter at the far end of the room. He sat down in front of it and adjusted the frequency himself with the practiced ease of someone who has done exactly this in far less comfortable settings, with far less at stake and far more at risk, and he opened a channel to the Keth command vessel. He spoke in Keth. Fluent Keth, not careful, stuttered Keth, not the Keth of someone who had learned it from books, but the Keth of someone who had lived inside it for a long time, the Keth that carried in its rhythms the particular knowledge of how the Keth think and what they value and what they fear. And Siraine could not understand the words, but she understood the tone completely, which was the same tone Marcus used for everything, which was even and unhurried and without any fear in it at all. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. At the end of the 4 minutes he closed the channel, stood up, picked up his cup again, and looked at the holographic display with the same patient attention he gave to everything. The 14 Keth ships held their position. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3. The War Council sat around the table and no one spoke, and the display pulsed its slow red pulse, and Breaker's hand was resting very close to the secondary controls for his fleet positions. At 6 minutes and 40 seconds, the Keth fleet turned. Not one ship, all 14, simultaneously, in a clean coordinated arc, turning away from Orani space and accelerating back in the direction they had come from. And within minutes they were outside engagement range, and within an hour they were gone from the sensors entirely. The War Council did not speak for a long time. And then, slowly, Everyone at the table turned to look at Marcus, who was looking at the now empty display the way he looked at everything, with calm attention and no particular need for anyone to acknowledge what had just happened. Emperor Davin stood up from his chair at the head of the table. He stood up slowly, with the deliberate care of a man who is about to do something he has not done before and wants to do it correctly, and he gestured to the chair beside him. "Sit with me," Davin said. Marcus looked at the chair, then at the Emperor, and he walked around the table and sat down beside the most powerful man in the Irani Empire, and the two of them began to speak quietly together, in the way of two people who have just arrived at an understanding that did not require any of the previous arrangements to go differently. Breaker sat very still across the table and said nothing. His fleet position display had gone dark. Lord Varret looked at his own hands. Serene watched from her seat and thought about a file with 4 lines and a man sitting in the dark with birds that were afraid of everything else in the galaxy, and she felt the last of the architecture she had spent months building around her assumptions about Marcus Hale come down completely and cleanly, the way a structure falls when it is finally safe to let it go. After the council ended and the chamber began to empty, Riven appeared at Serene's shoulder as he always did when he had something to say that required privacy. "I spoke with one of the junior communications officers," he said. Quietly, the one who monitored the channel during the transmission. She said she has studied Keth military dialect for 11 years. "And?" Serene asked. She said she understood approximately half of what he said, Riven told her, but she understood the last line clearly. She said the last thing he told the Keth commander, right before he closed the channel, was, "Tell your people the warning still applies." Serene was quiet for a moment. "Just that?" she asked. "Just that," Riven said. Serene walked to the window and looked out at the sky where the Keth fleet had been, at the clean, empty space where 14 warships had turned around because of one man sitting in front of a transmitter for 4 minutes, and she thought that somewhere out there, a young Keth commander was sitting in his ship and explaining to his officers why they were going home, and the explanation was going to be very short and very difficult to argue with the news moved through the galaxy the way significant things always move, first as rumor, then as confirmed report, then as something that people argued about in the corridors of every diplomatic installation and military briefing room from one edge of charted space to the other. 14 Keth warships had appeared at the Irani border with a specific and non-negotiable demand, and within hours of their arrival they had turned around and left, not because of a fleet engagement, not because of a treaty, not because of any military or political action that any of the galaxy's analysts could point to and explain in their reports, but because a human had sat down in front of a transmitter and spoken for 4 minutes. The requests for meetings began arriving at the Irani Palace within 2 days. Formal inquiries from 6 different species wanting official audiences, not with the Irani crown, but specifically and by name with Marcus Hale. 3 of these inquiries came from species that had never previously acknowledged the existence of a human diplomatic presence in any form or capacity. The Pelian representative, the same small delegate that Marcus had helped in the corridor of the summit, sent a gift and a handwritten personal note. The note was composed in 4 languages, one of which was an archaic dialect of High Keth that was considered obsolete even by active Keth scholars, and the gift was a ceremonial navigation compass that had belonged to a Pelian explorer who had survived something terrible in the dark of deep space by finding a direction home. The note said only, "You understand what this means. I believe you earned this before you earned the marriage." Marcus read the note twice, set the compass carefully on the shelf in his study with both hands as though placing something that deserved to be placed properly, and went to help the kitchen staff with a request they had made of him 2 days earlier, which was his opinion on adapting a human recipe for Irani dietary requirements. He spent an hour in the kitchen with them and they could be heard laughing twice. Serene observed all of this from a distance of approximately 2 days, which was how long it took her to arrange what she wanted to say into something that was not simply a list of questions stacked on top of each other. She found him in the evening on the balcony, which was where he always was when the work of the day was done. There were 5 of the small orange birds on the railing beside him now, which Serene had been quietly informed by a palace naturalist was not merely unusual but had no recorded precedent for the species. They were pressed against him in the relaxed, trusting way of creatures that have arrived at a decision and stopped revisiting it. She sat down in the chair across from his and he looked at her in the way he had of looking at things, patient and present, not pushing, not performing, just there. "I know about Ironwatch," she said. He was quiet. "I know about the Silence War and the 9 years behind enemy lines and the 7 who came back and the surrender and the blood warning." She looked at the birds once, then back at him. "I know about the memorial and what category your name is filed under." He turned his cup slowly in both hands, once, twice, and said, "Karev is very good at her job." Why did you not tell me? Sirain asked, and she was surprised to find that there was no sharpness in the question, only the genuine and open shape of wanting to understand. You came to this court and you let them treat you like a footnote. You let Breaker stand up in front of everyone at that banquet and say what he said. You let my father look at you the way he looks at unclaimed luggage, when you could have simply... She stopped. Why? Marcus looked at the sky for a moment. The twin moons of Verith Prime were both risen, which happened only a few times a year. And the doubled pale light they cast made the balcony feel like it existed at a slight remove from everything else. And then he looked at her and said, "The people who know what I have done, most of them are dead. The ones still alive do not need reminding." A pause that was simple and clean and not uncomfortable. "And I did not marry you to impress you." Sirain sat with this for a long moment. "Then why did you agree?" she asked. "You could have said no. Follis told me you were the only one who needed to agree, which means the decision was entirely yours. Why did you say yes to a marriage with a person you had never spoken to?" Marcus looked at her with the expression she had been. Slowly, carefully learning to read over the weeks and months of living beside him. It was the expression he wore when something was simply true and he was deciding whether to say it plainly or dress it in something more manageable. And apparently he chose plain, because he said, "At a summit full of people performing their own importance at each other, you were the only one who sat still and watched instead." She did not have an immediate response to this. "I have been in a lot of rooms with a lot of dangerous people over a long time," he said. "The ones you need to worry about are never the loud ones, and the ones worth actually knowing are almost always the ones who are watching. Everything and showing nothing." He looked back at the sky. "You watched me for 3 full days before you said a single word. I noticed that not many people in that room would have waited 3 days." Sirain sat very still and thought about being recognized, of all things, by a man with a sealed file and a Keth blood warning, for the habit she had spent her entire life using to recognize everyone else. "I want to know everything," she said. "Not the file, not the 4 lines in the memorial, not the intelligence summary, the actual story. The 9 years and what kept you going and what it was like at the end and what you said to the enforcer at the summit and what you said to the Keth commander on the channel. I want to know the man, not the record." Marcus looked at her for a moment, and his expression was not quite a smile, but it was clearly in that direction, and he said, "All right, but you go first." Sirain stared at him. "I just told you I know about Ironwatch," she said. "You know about a file," he said. "That is not the same as knowing someone. You go first, and then I will go, and we will know each other instead of knowing each other's records." He picked up his cup. "That seems like a considerably better arrangement for 2 people who are married." Sirain Varel, who had attended 41 diplomatic summits and given nothing away at a single one of them, who had been trained from the age of 7 to keep the interior of herself sealed in every room for every occasion, sat on a balcony on her homeworld in the light of 2 moons, and started talking. She talked for a long time. She talked about her mother, who had died when Sirain was small, and about growing up in a court where grief was treated as a structural weakness. She talked about the 40 summits and how lonely they were, how she had learned to read every room in the galaxy and still had not found anyone in any of them worth being fully honest with. She talked about the moment she saw him at the window with his plane cup and his stars and decided, on an impulse she still did not completely understand, that she wanted to know what a person like that was doing in a room like that. Marcus Hale sat across from her and listened with the same complete and unhurried attention he gave to everything. The stars, the birds, the holographic display of a fleet that turned around because of 4 minutes of quiet conversation. And somewhere in the middle of her talking, one of the small orange birds moved from the railing to the arm of her chair and settled there as if it had been planning to do this for some time and had simply been waiting for the right moment. In the morning, Marcus began to talk. And what he said, and how long it took, and what Sirain understood by the end of it about the particular kind of strength that does not perform itself, that chooses, every single day, to put itself down and be something quieter, is a story that belongs only to the 2 of them, on a balcony, in the light of 2 moons, with birds that were afraid of everything else in the known galaxy sitting between them like small orange witnesses. Far across the dark, in a Keth ship running quiet and fast away from Irani space, a commander was sitting alone in his cabin, and he was thinking about the voice on the channel, and the 4 minutes, and the last line that had made the decision for him before he had fully made it himself, and he was thinking about the story his own commander had told him when he was young, which was the story every Keth told when a young soldier needed to understand that some things in the galaxy did not obey the rules that governed everything else. He would tell it again, one day, to someone younger. He would tell it the same way it had always been told, which was quietly and without decoration, because the story did not need decoration. "There is a human," the story went. "You will know him because he will not raise his voice. and everything in you will say that this is a man you do not need to worry about. Do not listen to that feeling. Do not make him raise his voice. And when the young soldier asked what happened to those who did not listen, the answer was always the same. They became the reason the warning exists.